As expected, it's looking like decentralization is eventually going to play a big role in how crypto gets regulated. But this won't just be decentralization of validation and coin ownership. It'll also mean decentralized governance. Blockchains will have a choice here: transparent self rule, as in Cardano's plan, or the muddled ambiguity of social consensus, as in some other ecosystems. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss a certain interpretation of some recently released documents by a very possibly biased party and what that might mean for where Cardano's at in terms of governance and where it's going compared to its competitors. If you think those fish look a little overly colorful given the high mountain setting of this lake, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Here's an interesting CoinDesk article from just today. So this article is about the release of the Hinman Docs in the SEC Ripple case. But what's more interesting is the conclusion that this article and mainly JP Morgan are drawing from the release of those documents. It says the documents are likely to intensify the move among major cryptocurrencies to become more decentralized and look more like Ether, the report said. So there's a couple of things here, obviously. They're saying that all of a sudden, because the Hinman documents have been released in this SEC Ripple case, it dawned on all of the blockchain ecosystems that it is a good idea to be more decentralized. And while I think this is probably the case for certain blockchain ecosystems that are very much not decentralized, I think this has been a central focus of Cardano for a long time for a couple of different reasons. Because A, decentralization is good. It's what we're really after. We are trying to decentralize everything. So we're actually doing that in our blockchain ecosystem as opposed to a lot of other ecosystems. And B, we knew in Cardano that eventually this is going to be important for regulation. So there's a reason, obviously, that JP Morgan is coming to this conclusion. But the first paragraph says, the release of the Hinman papers last week in the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's case against Ripple is a boost to Ether and is likely to trigger a move to more decentralization in the crypto market, JP Morgan said in a research report Thursday. So obviously there are rumors of JP Morgan being tied up with a lot of Ethereum infrastructure. So they've got, there may be I'll put it like this. There may be an incentive for JP Morgan to hold Ethereum up as the model of decentralization. But what we know when you look at the actual numbers, and this happens a lot, this isn't a new story. People try to hold up Ethereum as the model of decentralization. But we know in terms of validation, that is certainly not the case. Ethereum has a very, 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 very low Nakamoto coefficient, rivaled only by Bitcoin. We've covered it many times on the channel, but since Ethereum has moved from proof of work to proof of stake, they are infamously validated 60% by something like 5 entities. You can see that here at stakingrewards.com. You've got Lido, Rocket Pool, and then Exchange Staking, which is mainly, I believe, Kraken, Binance, and Coinbase. And of course, that's not any kind of anomalous temporary spike because it's pretty much exactly what we saw 9 months ago when Cointelegraph reported this. The players have changed just slightly, but we still have a report of 64% of staked ETH controlled by 5 entities, apparently according to Nansen. And if we look at the composition of those, the only one that's changed is Rocket Pool. We had Lido, Coinbase, Kraken, Binance, and Staked.us. And of course, Ethereum is only bested here in terms of centralization by Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, you can choose just 3 mining pools that'll get you to 60%, which is kind of amazing, given that the whole thing was based on decentralization. And we could go through and name even more decentralized, smaller ecosystems out there. But the truth is, in terms of decentralization of validation, Ethereum is certainly not the king. In fact, they're not looking good at all in terms of decentralization of validation. Of course, we all know that Cardano is famously now at this point extremely decentralized compared to both Ethereum and Bitcoin. You can see in this pie chart here that you have to count something like over 30 stake pools to get above even 50%. Mind you, we were just talking about 60% of control of validation in both Ethereum and Bitcoin. But this is over 30 pools just to get to 50% in Cardano. So, what is an anti Cardano maximalist to do? The anti Cardano Ethereum people found out that Cardano is not just a little bit, but much more decentralized in terms of validation than Ethereum. The Bitcoin guys found out the same thing. Cardano is just much, much more decentralized than either of those two blockchains. So, what are they to do? They want to point the finger and they want to be able to point to decentralization. They want to be able to say that they're more decentralized in some way than Cardano. So what tactic do they turn to? They say, yeah, but Charles could turn off the blockchain. IOG, IOHK could turn off the blockchain anytime they want. You guys have no decentralization. This, in fact, is not the case. So there were actually 7 Genesis keys in Cardano. IOG has only 3 of the 7. The Cardano Foundation has another 2, and Emergo has another 2. This kind of makes sense. If you think about who is doing a lot of the core protocol work in Cardano, that's obviously IOG. And they don't even have a majority of the Genesis keys. CF has 2, Emergo has 2. And there have been times in the past when the Cardano Foundation has delegated their keys to IOG. And I've seen reports even recently that maybe Emergo has delegated their keys to IOG at certain points. But nobody is saying that there has ever been any ownership of these keys, except what you see right here. 3 Genesis keys owned by IOG, 2 by the CF, and 2 by Emergo. When IOG is doing all these crazy iterations of protocol work and they're, changing things inside the actual running of our blockchain, it kind of makes sense that if they're doing a bunch of things in succession, they might confer with the CF and with Emergo and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Are you cool with that? We're going to do that over this time period to make it easier. Or do you just want to delegate your keys to us right now? And it looks like that's happened, at least in the case of the CF. And I've also seen reports that that's what's happened in the case of Emergo. So it's not actually the case that IOG could turn off the blockchain. They've never owned a majority of the Genesis keys, which would be required to turn off the blockchain. The CF and Emergo together own more of the Genesis keys than IOG does. And this is only temporary. Here's the important part. This is where we are right now. You've got 7 Genesis keys. Nobody has a majority of them. There have been these delegation events in the past, apparently, but, those were probably just done for convenience. But this isn't even where we're going. This was just the temporary centralization of development decisions as far as core Cardano goes. But where we're going is actually probably something that looks a lot like SIP 1694 Voltaire self-governance. We've talked about that several times in great detail on this channel. You can go back and watch those videos if you want to know how that works. But basically, we'll have 3 entities: a constitutional committee, a body of DREPs, and the body of stake pool operators. And they'll all be involved in various different categories of decisions, with the DREPs probably having the most power and doing a lot of the decision making, and the stake pool operators and the constitutional committee coming in different circumstances to also participate. But we're moving away from this temporary structure that allowed for a more rapid development of the Cardano core protocol and into an era where we'll actually have self-rule by the holders of ADA, because they'll be the ones delegating to the DREPs who will make up that pool of DREPs doing a lot of the decision making. It will no longer be IOG and Emergo and the Cardano Foundation, making these decisions even about the core protocol development. But here's what's amazing. Even the system we have right now, the thing we're moving away from, is much more transparent than what we see in some of our main competitor blockchains. Thank you to Andrew Westberg for putting together that informative video about 10 months ago. That was a screen we were just looking at. But speaking of that, it's interesting what we found out from the Wall Street Journal about 4 months ago. That's that only 5 people were keeping the Bitcoin core protocol code alive. We found this out after the lead maintainer of the Bitcoin core code GitHub had to move on, and they were left with 5 core maintainers. So think about this for a second. Back in February, Bitcoin only had 5 people left who really had GitHub commit access. In Cardano, we've got 3 substantial entities. We've got IOG, which I believe is the largest group of Haskell developers in the entire world. I don't think anyone has more Haskell developers than IOG. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that was or is the case. It's a huge number of people. It's a large company now, and a great number of people in IOG have been involved in core protocol development of Cardano. Then you've got the Cardano Foundation. Then you've got Emerco. This is a much larger number of people than just 5 people who apparently have GitHub commit access for the Bitcoin core code. Then we've got Ethereum, who from a PR perspective at least play a much more clever game than Bitcoin with their 5 core maintainers. So ethereum.org has this governance page, and there's a lot of different sections. What is governance, decentralized governance, Ethereum governance, and in this section, on-chain versus off-chain governance. So in the first paragraph, they tell you all about on-chain governance, and it sounds pretty great. Then down here, they tell you, oh, but that's not what we do. Ethereum governance happens off-chain with a wide variety of stakeholders involved in the process. So you ask the question, okay, how wide is the spectrum of people who get to be involved in the process, and how involved are they really? They say off-chain governance is where any protocol change decisions happen through an informal process of social discussion, which, if approved, would be implemented in code. Okay, so suddenly you find out this is not even a formal process. This isn't a formal framework like we've got in Cardano Voltaire governance under SIP 1697. This is an informal process that works by social consensus. This is very different. So if we come up here, they say there is a process to propose changes to the core protocol, which decentralized applications run on top of. Since so many people depend on Ethereum stability, there is a very high coordination threshold for core changes. Okay, that all sounds good, including social and technical processes to ensure any changes to Ethereum are secure and widely supported by the community. So once again, you see this is all working through social consensus. I mean, they've got like EIP editors and a process there that the EIPs go through, but really the decision making is by social consensus. And this is where we run into a problem, because what history has shown us is that social consensus is often pointed to by priestly wizard classes who are the elites. If you have in governance, if you have elites and the people, what often happens is when the elites don't actually want the people to have self-rule, they can often accomplish sort of a PR coup by convincing the people that they have a lot of input into the governance process, when actually it's just the priestly wizard class that's making all the decisions. And the way you do this is by preventing transparency. And you can often do this by creating an opaque cloak of social consensus. So if you go on the all core devs calls, when Ethereum is making a decision on a big Ethereum improvement proposal, they'll have these all core devs calls right on YouTube, and you can go on and listen to these calls live and see what's going on, see what kind of discussion's going on. But what's interesting is on those calls, it's just a handful of people who are really involved in the decision-making process. And it's often just sort of the technical process of how to get things done. It's sort of a lot of the discussion going on is just sort of how to get things done. What's interesting is that's actually by design. If you come to the EIPs page at ethereum.org, you find this warning. The EIPs process and the all core devs call were not designed to address contentious non-technical issues. So they weren't addressed. The core devs call and the EIP process was not designed to address the non-technical issues. It was designed to address the technical issues. But due to the lack of other ways to address these, that's the non-technical issues, like, should we do this thing? The all core devs call often, and these non-technical issues often end up entangled in the all core devs call and the EIP process. This puts the burden on client implementers to try and gauge community sentiment. Does that sound good? They should try and gauge community sentiment, which hinders the technical coordination function of EIPs and all core devs calls. If you are shepherding an EIP, you can make the process of building community consensus easier by making sure that the Ethereum Magicians Forum thread for your EIP includes or links to as much of the community discussion as possible, and that various stakeholders are well represented. So you hear that the person shepherding the EIP is responsible for making sure the community discussion is included in the thread and that various stakeholders are well represented on a forum called the Ethereum Magicians Forum. We've actually looked at this forum in past videos on this channel, but this is all very interesting, right? The person who wants the EIP to make it through is the one that's responsible for various stakeholders being well represented. Of course, this is a moral problem, because if you want your EIP to get through, you are going to have a huge temptation not to make sure the stakeholders who are against your EIP are well represented in the thread. In fact, you might make your Ethereum Magicians Forum thread as stealthy as possible to those various stakeholders who might be against your EIP. You have a huge incentive to do that, because this isn't like a federal government agency notice period where everything's pushed out there for everyone to see and they're supposed to solicit comments and all those kind of things. You could say that this is, some version of that. They are supposed to post this EIP in this forum to try to build consensus, but this is all informal and through social consensus. I mean, you can imagine if everybody in the priestly wizards class wants something and the people don't want it, it probably has a much greater chance of getting through than if the people really wanted something and the priestly wizards class, in this case, the magicians class, really don't want it. This is not a sustainable system. These kinds of systems that don't have formal frameworks for governance, that are just based on social consensus. What history shows us is that these types of systems tend to go awry. They tend not to be sustainable. These aren't the systems that last a long time, because what happens is initially you might have the people might have trust in the priestly wizard class. They might trust them initially, but eventually competing factions, competing interest groups emerge, and you lose trust in this opaque social consensus cloak that is there in place of true transparency and a formal framework. One of those things tends to be more sustainable. Formal frameworks can go wrong too. Those can collapse as well. But a formal framework with a lot of transparency tends to be a lot more sustainable than the opaque cloak of social consensus. And I think any kind of sort of formal examination of what happens in Ethereum, in governance that works through social consensus, like in Ethereum, versus what we're going to have in Cardano's Voltaire governance. I think any kind of objective academic examination of those two is going to say that this social consensus informal governance is much more susceptible to a very small elite class dominating everything, even if they're sort of saying no, 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 I mean, this is like a very common thing with dictators throughout history. If someone goes to the dictator and says, hey, are you taking into account the desires and needs of the people? They're always going to say, of course I am. I have all of these advisors. I have so many advisors, and they represent the will of the people. They're actually just, forming a consensus with me about what's best for the people. And my advisors and myself, we represent what's best for the people. So then the next question is, well, why don't you just let the people vote? And they're like, no, 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 that's not the efficient way to do it. The efficient way to do it is through social consensus. I just have my advisors go out and talk to people, and they sort of, get the pulse of the social consensus. And, that's very similar to what we see here. They say, this puts the burden on client implementers to try and gauge community sentiment. And then they say, if you're shepherding an EIP, you should try to make sure that various stakeholders are well represented. This is very similar to what a dictator would say about how they're ruling their people. You know what else a dictatorship would say? Oh, you have a nation improvement proposal? Make sure you file that over there with the NIP ministry. But while you're doing that, also be sure to shepherd that through the Magicians Forum, where you'll need to build a certain amount of social consensus, which I will absolutely prevent you from building with my influence if I don't like your proposal. So why, despite all of this, would that JP Morgan report be saying that all the other blockchains are going to be chasing the decentralization of Ethereum? Maybe it has something to do with articles like this. This article in TechCrunch back in 2021 noted Consensus, a key player in crypto and a major proponent of the Ethereum blockchain, has raised a $65 million funding round from JP Morgan, MasterCard, and UBS. Or maybe it had to do with articles like this one from 2022 that said Consensus lawsuit reveals JP Morgan owns critical Ethereum infrastructure. So this article says, and I'm not reporting this as fact, I'm just reciting what this article reported, that as part of a deal between Consensus and JP Morgan, the deal resulted in financial institutions, JP Morgan in a parenthetical, winning a significant slice in the company's lucrative intellectual property, specifically MetaMask and Infura. Both crypto wallet MetaMask and node network Infura persist as arguably the Ethereum ecosystem's most critical infrastructure. Turns out Wall Street fat cats JP Morgan directly profit from and even control that infrastructure. So obviously JP Morgan has, if this is all true, JP Morgan has a pretty big vested interest in Ethereum being the preeminent, at least smart contract blockchain. I think Bitcoin's reign at the top of the charts may last a while, but they at least want Ethereum to retain its place as the number 2 and the preeminent smart contract blockchain if they've invested this much into Ethereum infrastructure. But I think no matter what they do, there is a huge gulf between transparent democratic self-rule like we're moving toward in Cardano and what they have in Ethereum, where they don't even believe in on-chain governance. They believe in this opaque cloak of social consensus. Those are two very different things, and no matter what they say, the latter thing does not equate to the former thing. And I think everybody who's an actual citizen of one of these blockchain ecosystems would probably rather have transparent, democratic self-rule. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.